I mean to give the French a damn good thrashing.
The Napoleonic Wars, the first Great War, an era that saw the British Army come of age. But how much do you know about the officers at the forefront of the war?
Oh my God, Southern's fall back, fall back!
Were they all aristocratic buffoons like Henry Simmerson in the Sharp series? Were most commissions and promotions paid for? What sort of training did they receive? And were battalion commanders actually younger and more dynamic than their counterparts in other armies? We are going to be busting plenty of myths today. The answers to these questions really surprised me, and I think you may be shocked.
Now's your time!
Today's guest is Steve Brown. He spent years researching regimental and battalion commanders of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. His book Fit to Command is now out and can be purchased from Helion Books. There's a link in the description below. I started off by asking Steve how a man became an officer in the first place.
A young gentleman wishing to become an officer merely had to apply in writing to the Commander-in-Chief via the Commander-in-Chief's military secretary, and the letter of application must contain a letter from an eminent person, and ideally an army officer, if possible, or if not, some person who's eminent in society, recommending the young officer for a post in His Majesty's Army, together with the cost of the purchase of a commission, and sit back and wait. And then eventually, a lot of young officers found out their destiny by referring to the Gazette. You know, your typical entry would say, young master whomever is hereby appointed ensign in the, 4th Mud Guards or whatever, effective date of, today's date. And that's how they found out. People who with an earlier copy of the Gazette obviously can run around and knock on the door and say, hey, congratulations. So that's really how it happened, hence why young officers were gazetted, because that's actually how they found out what lay in store for them, which is a word that even sort of remains today, even though I'm not sure that promotions appear in the Gazette anymore.
I'm going to briefly interrupt here for a moment because I have a video coming up soon that takes a deep dive into the purchase system and how officers paid for their rank. As you can imagine, it's a complicated and controversial subject, and therefore I thought it was worthy of its own film. Be sure to subscribe if that sounds interesting. Okay, let's pick up with Steve explaining what sort of training officers would have had.
Well, certainly for the first, let's call it first 10 years of the war, and when I talk about the war, I'm talking about the Great War with France, which was considered to have existed from 1793, early 1793 till late 1815, with a 14-month intermission between 1802 and 1803 when they were all able to go into the foyer and buy ice creams and lollies and things before they go back to action again. For the first sort of 10 years of the war, everything was strictly on-the-job training. There was nowhere a young officer to go to learn other than turning up and square bashing and being put through their paces by the adjutant and the sergeant major, along with a batch of other young officers, and having to learn the standing orders for the unit, which are usually written by the commanding officer, and also having to learn the infamous or famous David Dundas drill manual, which ran to something like 350 pages, of all the evolutions they were expected to carry out or be capable of making their troops carry out. Day in, day out, that was what they did. Possible exceptions to that were particularly under John Moore's tutelage at Shorncliffe with the light infantry regiments, particularly the 43rd and the 52nd. He actually made his young officers put on packs, pick up muskets and train with the men. You know, every so often he'd make them run up a big hill and back down again, sort of shades of Band of Brothers, to weed out those who weren't suitable and those who weren't fit enough. And all that kind of stuff went on. So that was very much the sort of light infantry sort of ethos. A formal training academy didn't really exist until, really after 1800, when, the celebrated cavalry commander, Jean Le Marchand, created or put forward to the Duke of York the idea for a staff college, which was created in rented rooms at the rear of the Antelope Inn in High Wycombe, which then later evolved into a senior school and a junior school. The senior school being a place to train existing serving officers, usually of the rank of captain or above, for roughly 18 months, 2 years worth of higher staff training, I guess you'd call it. And there's also a junior school designed to attract 16 and 17-year-olds to put them through effectively a staff training college, which when discharged, they could then straight from there to their regiments and join as ensigns straight from the Royal Military College. And obviously, somewhere along the line, and I think it was about 1820, both branches of the college merged and took up new residence at Sandhurst, of course, which of course is where it is to this day. The artillery actually had a military academy since I think about 1740 at Woolwich. The Royal Military Academy, and you could not become an ordnance officer without passing out of Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. That was, you passed to become a second lieutenant in the artillery. So it was kind of an evolving process, and the fruits of it were starting to become evident by about the time of Waterloo, when a decent percentage of staff officers and officers in some of the leading regiments were effectively High Wycombe, or perhaps should I say Sandhurst graduates, starting to make a difference within the army for the first time. And of course, Sandhurst has existed and produced officers ever since.
Steve, so obviously you've really looked at the data, you've dived into the sort of backgrounds of these battalion commanders. What has been some of the most interesting things you've learned in your research? What can you tell us about, their backgrounds, what surprised you, that sort of thing?
I think the backgrounds of the officer cadres that I've looked at show some remarkably consistent elements, and it shows some interesting demographic elements, and it shows some very, very interesting data about the backgrounds. For example, I looked at all of the field officers in the first lifeguards, and you would imagine the first lifeguards to be awash with aristocrats. In fact, that was not the case. First lifeguards field officers between 1793 and 1815, there is only one aristocrat, and he's the son of an earl. He's not actually an earl himself, so he's the honourable. But you've got a son of a merchant. You've got a couple of sons of MPs. You've got a few sons of army and navy officers, and a few of them are the sons of what I would call landed proprietors, or the esquire class, who really were, I think, the backbone of the army of this period. Middling sons of landed families, and when I say landed families, they didn't have to have a castle or a manor or hundreds of acres. They might have had 5 acres, but they were really the kind of the backbone of the army, that sort of class. And when I say middling sons, of course, it was the old thing that the eldest son was going to inherit the estate. The second son went into the navy. The third son went into the army. The fourth son became a reverend. And it's amazing how often this is true. And the Wellesleys followed that formula exactly. Of all people. I also looked at a more typical line regiment. I'm sure the Royal Fusiliers may not like themselves being called a typical line regiment, but they were the 7th Foot. And you've got, a lot of the same kinds of things, lots and lots of sons of landed proprietors and former army officers, because, the sons following their dads into the army was always a popular thing. There was 2 officers who were the sons of, actually one of them was the son of a former PM, Cavendish Bentinck, and one son of an earl and one son of a baron, and then a whole bunch of outliers. You've got a son of a US loyalist, a son of a Huguenot refugee, a son of a German merchant, and a former NCO, who was lieutenant colonel in the Royal Fusiliers in this period. So it's a real mishmash. And I think overall, if you sort of analyse the data and sifted it through scientific methods, you would end up with the inevitable bell curve that you've got, the high point of the curve in the middle. You've got your landed proprietors and middle-class sons of army officers. Down the left-hand end, you've got a smattering of former rankers. And at the right-hand end, again, at the sort of skinny end on the right, you've got, you know, aristocrats or near aristocrats. But by and large, the rump of the army was kind of middle class, sons of merchants, sons of landed proprietors, sons of former army officers, sons of reverends were quite common, sons of doctors. You know, that was the lifeblood of the officer class back then.
Well, I guess my next question leading on from that is kind of the ages of battalion commanders. Did you find there was a lot of talented younger guys, or was it generally kind of, guys in their middle age and so forth?
Yeah, I looked at 20 campaigns between 1793 and 1815, and I looked at the total CO cohort for each of those campaigns and looked at their average ages, how long they'd been in the army, how long they'd been in command. And it showed a couple of very interesting things, some of which were quite explainable by the time and the place that the campaign occurred and mitigating factors that influenced it. But on the whole, an amazing consistency came out between the average age and the average years of service of the officers. Your typical lieutenant colonel, pretty much throughout the entire era, and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to look at some data here while we do this, was about 37 to 38 years old, typically with about 18 to 19 years of service in the army. Your typical brigadier, and I include brigadiers here because brigadier general back then wasn't a rank, it was an appointment. It only lasted for the duration of the campaign, and a lot of COs were plucked to be brigadiers for the duration. So it was a fine line between, where does a CO end and where does a brigadier start. And your average brigadier was about 42 years of age with about 25 years of experience. Compared to the counterparts, as I've said, the COs in that age range were about 10 years younger than their counterparts in the Royal Artillery, were interestingly about the same age as COs in French regiments. I mean, there's a tendency to think that French regiments the COs must have been younger and more vigorous, but actually, no, they were about the same age. And COs in Prussian regiments were older by a couple of years, and COs in Austrian regiments were a lot older. So not only did the British Army have one of the younger CO cohorts of any army in Europe, but they were also extremely experienced. I mean, if you're 38, you've been in the army for 19 years, it's pretty much all you know. And in 19 years, you'd have seen a lot of campaigns. So the fact, people who think that, perhaps some of these officers were sort of puffed up guys who jumped in and purchased their way up and hadn't been around that long and they're commanding troops in battle with no experience, the figures do not bear that out, I have to say.
I mean, I don't have these statistics in front of me, but just at a guess, I would say the average age of a lieutenant colonel in the British Army now is probably late 30s, early 40s. Yes. I could be wrong there, but I would say that's probably similar.
I looked it up. It's almost identical.
Right. Isn't that interesting? Talking of sort of battalion commanders then during this era, what would the sort of day-to-day life on campaign have been like for a battalion commander? What were their main sort of responsibilities and duties day to day, and then later on, in combat?
Well, I think this slide perhaps will explain some of that. I mean, on campaign, there would have been a lot of tedium, boredom, and going through the motions because, the Peninsular War, for example, started in, what was it? August 1808 and went till April 1814. So it's 6 years almost. And in some years, the army only fought a handful of battles. Yep. So what were they doing the other 363 days of the year? Just going through the motions and managing the battalion on a daily basis with trying to deal with the day-to-day boredom and tedium that goes with it. And this slide here shows all of the things that, by and large, the CO would have been responsible for, although the CO, yes, they were the person the buck stops with, but they would not be the person doing all of these things because the CO would have been able to delegate all of these to, 2 majors, each one commanding half the battalion, and also commanding the drill sessions and the inspections, the adjutant, the young officer responsible for day-to-day administration, bookkeeping, and all that kind of stuff, the sergeant major, who is the senior NCO of the battalion, the quartermaster responsible for stores and picking out the stopping point for the next night and looking for accommodation and housing and making sure all the troops are fed and that sort of thing. And the surgeon, and who else have I missed? Paymaster, yes, very important one. Paymaster, responsible for doling out the cash to the troops on payday. So a lot of them would have been responsible for this, and a good CO would have pushed a lot of this or delegated a lot of this down to particularly the adjutant and the two majors to make sure it happened. The adjutant would have been working in conjunction with the sergeant major. The majors would then have been working in association with their company commanders, because there was 10 companies, therefore 10 company commanders, usually captains, to make sure that all of these things get done. And for probably 16 hours a day, we're just dealing with all of this kind of day-to-day stuff before they could even think about, picking up their muskets to go into action on the couple of days a year when there was actually battles on.
Well, let's drill down then into those, 2 or 3 days a year where they might actually have seen some serious combat. Generally, let's say you're a lieutenant colonel in command of a battalion. Let's say maybe you've got 500-600 men fit under your command in the battle. Would you have actually, what decision making would you have been allowed to, what decisions could you have made? How much freedom would you have been given? Were they able to show sort of tactical nous, or was it very much kind of, top down, do this, do that, and they didn't really get to show their own talents?
Unlike perhaps Hollywood-esque notions of commanding on the battlefield, a certain film that's coming up that involves Napoleon drawing his sword and charging at the head of the cavalry, which actually never happened, I'm sure, once in his entire career. But anyway, let's not get into that. This slide I particularly like because it shows two versions of the same action seen from two vantage points. On the left, we have a British battalion, I think it's the 50th Foot, advancing downhill to meet a French column. They're in two deep line, which was the traditional way of, well, not traditional, but certainly the way that Wellington chose to employ the army in the peninsula. Each of the 10 companies are in a line. The commanding officer or captain commanding each company is on the right-hand end of the line at the front, with his covering sergeant with a pike immediately behind him. Somewhere close to the center of the battalion, you've got the two ensigns, the two most junior ensigns carrying the colors, supported by 6 sergeants with a pike for the color party. Forming a loose third line behind them, you have the other officers and sergeants. They're mainly to push men back into the ranks and to walk along behind them, shouting encouragement. And then in another line behind them, you have the drummers. And also in that sort of fourth line, you also have the mounted officers. Only the lieutenant colonel, majors, and adjutant were mounted, not every company officer in battle. The commanding officer was mounted at the rear of the colour party, so he can get a sense of what the entire battalion is doing. He has his 2 majors mounted as well, and they are behind each of their wings, so they are adding a kind of localized command and control. As you can see, the CO is not out the front waving his sword and charging at the enemy. That's not how they worked. Command and control was everything, and he needed to be able to see what was going on. And really, the dressing of the ranks and the way companies conducted themselves was the domain of the majors commanding the wings and the captains commanding the companies. But the intention was that a battalion in line advancing maintained as tight a front and as straight a line as humanly possible. No gaps in the line. If a gap created, you'd have the officers and the sergeants in the third rank yelling, close up, close up. Or if they're coming to grips with the enemy, and the front rank may in fact kneel to fire, and the rear rank remain standing. Of course, the sergeants and the officers will be walking up and down behind them saying, choose your targets, men. aim carefully, don't get too excited. You know, a bit like Colour Sergeant Bourne, you know, it was spot on. You also notice on the left-hand picture that you can just see the 52nd Light Infantry filing into position under their CO on the right-hand side of the 50th, preparatory to delivering a flank attack on the French column. The 52nd seemed to be quite good at that. I'm sure those who know about Waterloo will immediately recognise that tactic. And on the right-hand side of this image, of course, you can see the French in their typical tactical arrangement of companies in 3-deep line, in column, so a gigantic mass of men. This is not the Imperial Guard. These were, in fact, converged grenadiers at a time when grenadiers in the French army still wore bearskin hats. And you can see the sergeant major behind each company, but the company commander marching along in front of each company, which is a little bit different. This battle was the first use of shrapnel, and you can probably see a couple of fellows on the right-hand side there who are enjoying the exposure to it, or not. You can tell that, well, this is at a time when a number of French regiments actually had white uniforms rather than blue. And the French in summer in the peninsula habitually wore their greatcoats, and they kept their blue uniforms rolled up in their pack because the greatcoats were a lighter material and looser and therefore cooler. So hence why they look like there. But as you can see, the sort of the comparison of the two difficult sort of tactical doctrines of the two armies. So it's all about command and control, not getting out of hand. And there are some instances where regiments or battalions did get out of hand, not the least of which was the foot guards at Talavera, where they advanced too far, got cut up, and the 23rd Light Dragoons at the same battle sort of lost control. So maintaining control was paramount on the battlefield, and that was probably the CO's major, other than motivating the men, it's probably his major responsibility. And of course,
so there would have been
where he stood and what he did in terms of higher level tactics was as dictated to him by his brigadier. So he would have been standing on the battle. His battalion would have been standing on the battlefield where his brigadier told him to stand, and the brigadier, of course, is receiving orders from the divisional commander, usually a major general, about moving your brigade to the left or to the right. So the sort of chain of command thing was ever present, but it is today as well, of course.
Yeah. So there would have been very few opportunities for sort of full autonomy for these guys to really show what they were capable of.
Yeah, probably not a huge amount, but there are obviously celebrated examples. And I did mention, Colborne's flank attack on the 52nd at Waterloo, which of course is quite famous. But there's also, Henry Harding at Albuera, who on his own volition rode to the rear and brought up a brigade to plug a hole in the line. And I think he was only I think he was a major or something at the time. He was relatively junior. But he, completely off his own back, advanced an entire brigade to plug a hole in the line, which turned out to be crucial.
Do you discipline my orders, sir?
From all your research, I'm guessing you read a lot of correspondence from these guys and so forth. Do they come across as quite a likable bunch? Like, do you come away from it thinking actually their depiction, especially in sort of modern films and TV shows, is perhaps unfair, and that these seem like a pretty decent bunch of blokes?
Well, there was a lot of them. I mean, I think I worked out that in the period I was looking at, there was something like 4,000 field officers. Just trying to make broad generalizations is quite difficult, but I think on the whole, as a cohort, they were extremely professional. They were dedicated, and like any group of people that's that big, you got all sorts of characters, and trying to sort of paint them with one brush is extraordinarily difficult. I think they were a different cohort than the cohort that followed them after 1815, because the army changed quite a bit between 1815 and 1854. I think in the years after Waterloo, the army became less middle class, if that's the right term. And I looked at all the regiments that landed in the Crimea in 1854 and where their COs came from, and I compared them with exactly the same regiments in 1815 and looked at their COs to see where they come from, and there was actually quite a shift in the army. I mean, in 1815, of the cohort that I looked at, less than 20% were the sons of officers. By 1854, nearly half were sons of officers. So the army had become very much a family concern. The representation of the landholding class officers had gone down from 40% to about a quarter, because, you know, in the Victorian era, I think heads of families were realizing that the army as a career for their son was perhaps not as good a career choice as it had been, you know, before the Industrial Revolution. With industry and commerce going the way it was in the Victorian era, there were far better career choices than becoming an officer, perhaps. Sons of aristocracy went up, so there were more aristocrats in the army. And I also had a look at, sorry, let's get the right slide here. Also had a look at the 33rd Foot, the Duke of Wellington's regiment, how it promoted its officers in 1815 versus how it promoted its officers in 1854. And in 1815, about 40% of all officers within the 33rd had gained their current rank by purchase. By 1854, it was 85%. So most officers by Crimean War were purchasing their commissions, where back in, you know, the time of Waterloo, it was somewhere between a third and a half. So it was a big change. And the army became more exclusive, more focused on purchase, less representation from the middle class. It was really officered by, you know, the dandies, the sons of aristocrats, and particularly the sons from army families who had swelled enormously in number, which I guess is understandable. You've got the generations following Waterloo, the sons wanting to emulate their fathers who had done all those deeds between 1793 and 1815. So I guess, you know, that's kind of a natural reaction. But I thought that was quite an interesting analysis to see how the army had changed. I guess going back to the original question, were they a likable bunch? Yeah, I think so. I quite enjoyed being in their company for the last couple of years. There's some good ones, there's some bad ones. I think, and they perhaps never got a lot of press because a lot of the sort of airtime has been taken up by the Peninsula and the Waterloo officers. But I think in terms of the quality of the men involved, I think the CEOs of the regiments in India deserve a lot of credit. They were a long way from home. It was very hard for them to sail home again. You know, if you're a CO in Portugal, it's a week to get home, basically. If you're in India, it was 6 months. And so COs didn't generally sail home from India, and the regiments served there for a long time. So the officers, the NCOs, and the men of the regiments in India formed very close bonds. And the COs in particular were fighting in hard conditions with tenuous supply trains against an enemy that's not fighting in the European tradition and doing things in an unconventional manner, an often quite ruthless manner. I think those men deserve a huge credit, certainly a lot more than they've been given in the press over the years, and they may just be perhaps the best cohort of COs in the British Army at that time.
If you want to learn more about the British Army of the Napoleonic and Victorian eras, watch these films on screen now. Steve will be back on the show soon to explain why the great Richard Sharp was actually a slacker and an underachiever. It'll all make sense when you watch it. Make sure to subscribe to find out why.